It's good to see everyone tonight. We appreciate every effort you've made to be here. Before we get started, I did want to mention that I am scheduled, if I don't back out, to go to Indian Creek tomorrow to begin directing my 16th year as director at Indian Creek Youth Camp. And I just wanted to say publicly in front of this good audience how much gratitude I have to Ronnie Hayes. Ronnie basically got me my start and encouraged me so much and really helped establish the pattern that I've tried to follow for 16 years. And I just thank him more than he could possibly know for everything he's done for me. I don't know if I've ever told you that, but I just thought I'd like to. It just means a lot to me. I had not been dating what would become my wife, Tracy, very long when I realized I had a problem. And my guess would be your immediate reaction tonight would be what Clark's about to tell me is not very surprising. I did not have the best of success with the ladies when I was young. I remember going up to Kim. I call her Kim because that was her name. I went up to her and I said, "Will you go with me to the homecoming game?" And she said, "I don't think so." And that's kind of how she said it. And then she went with my brother. So when Tracy, for whatever reason, began to show a remote interest in me, I wanted things to work out. And at that time, I was driving a Volkswagen Rabbit. And I like to say early on that the creator of the Volkswagen Rabbit was not a romantic man at all. The car was set up, with his, had to change gears and everything. And I was wanting this thing to work out. And I would find myself driving through Tuscaloosa and Tracy would be with me in the Volkswagen Rabbit. And just across the Black Warrior River from Northport into Tuscaloosa, there's this series of about 5 or 6 red lights that happen over the course of about 2 or 3 blocks. And I would just notice as we drove through town that it was just a continual stop, first, second, third, fourth gear, stop, first, second, and it was a pattern that was keeping my arm from being around her shoulder, which is really where I wanted it to be. And here's the thing too. I kind of came to this deduction. The developer of that red light system in Tuscaloosa was probably the brother of the developer of the Volkswagen Rabbit because he wasn't romantic either. So I began studying on this thing, and here's what I ultimately came to. I could take my right hand, my left hand, and I could put it on the gear, and I could have my left forearm driving the car. So I'd be like, here's would be the steering wheel, and then my hand would be changing gears, and my arm could stay around her shoulder. Now, they don't promote this in the driver's manual, but we have been married close to 30 years, and we have 4 children, so I figure it worked out somewhere. Here's the point. No matter how difficult something might be, if it's worth it to you, you'll pay whatever price you have to pay to make it happen. And ultimately, when you're discussing the subject that we will be discussing over the course of this weekend that has become a traditional part of this soul-winning workshop, ultimately, that's the question we come down to, is how much does it mean to you? I'm fascinated by Acts chapter 2. I believe there's aspects to it that we miss that I think are pretty significant. I think about the question, what shall we do? And I think about the answer that Peter and the apostles gave. And I think about the fact that on that day, the Bible tells us about 3,000 were baptized, and here's the description, that day. And I think in some ways, the significance of that is easy to miss. Have you ever thought about the logistical nightmare it had to be for 3,000 people to be baptized that day? I can't think of one thing easy about that process. There are a number of details that are given that tell us that out of this mass of people who were there on that day of Pentecost, this is the approximate number that was baptized, and we're told specifically that they were baptized that day. Now, what all happened to make that happen? I don't know. I kind of figure in my mind it must have been a number of people who were baptized and then started baptizing. 3,000 that day? A logistical nightmare. But on the other hand, a grouping of people that had come to the conclusion, I don't want to go to bed one more night lost. It must be that important. It must really be a big deal. And I think about Luke chapter 15 that tells us about 99 people who were right where they were supposed to be. And there was one who had gone astray. And Jesus delivered a powerful message. And first of all, let me step back and say this. If you get 99% of any grouping in the acceptable place, you've done something incredible. The best free throw shooters in this world make somewhere around 90% of their foul shots. If you can get a base hit 3 out of every 10 times you go to the plate, you can be a millionaire multiple times over. If one of my children could happen to bring home a report card that even started with a 9, I'd be thrilled. The truth is, a lot of our church buildings could not even handle it if 90% of your membership all decided to attend the same day. 99% is staggering. And yet Jesus said, if you have 99 right where they're supposed to be, and there's one who's not, then you drop everything you're doing and you go find that one. Because every soul matters. Everyone. Tonight, in this section of our study, we're going to be looking at a Christian's view of personal evangelism. And what I'd like to do is to begin in the book of Acts and take us through a number of characters who, they're not all equivalent. They're not all the same. They clearly did not all have the same abilities. Their prominence in biblical history would not be equivalent. But yet each of them are integral in personal evangelism. Every one of them committed themselves in special, unique ways to reaching out to lost souls. And I want us to look at a few characteristics that I need to apply. I don't know that any man has ever stood before an audience to speak on a subject that man would feel so unworthy to address it like I do tonight. So unworthy. Such a work in progress. Nowhere close to where I want to be. Nowhere close to where I need to be. Can I tell you a little secret? I'd appreciate it if you didn't tell anybody. I've got people that live in my neighborhood and I don't know their name. I can remember when I was growing up, your neighborhood was your world. You know, we'd get daylight and we'd get outside and we'd be with our neighbors and we'd be there till dark. I live in a fairly large neighborhood and I'm just telling you the truth. There's some people, I don't even know their name. But before I beat myself up too bad, I doubt I'm the Lone Ranger in this room. A lot of us have a ways to go. A lot of us are a work in progress. I want to start in Acts chapter 7 by taking a glance at Stephen. And I wanted to submit to you tonight that Stephen's view of evangelism was convicted. Stephen was a man who was full of conviction, that had a message to deliver, and he was not about to quit. One of the interesting things about Stephen's message in Acts chapter 7 that is fascinating to me, even as a preacher, Stephen could have quit somewhere around 80 or 85% into his message. He could have quit. And everybody who was assembled that day in Acts chapter 7, they'd line up in the foyer and they'd go by and shake his hand and they'd say, "Well done, Stephen. I sure enjoyed that lesson." If he quits after about 85%, those in that audience that evening, that day, would have been in complete agreement with everything that he had to say. And can I throw in this little tidbit? He would also have been teaching truth. And all he's got to do is quit. Just stop. And he could pillow his head that night. And he could tell himself, I taught truth. And those people would have been agreeable and encouraged and supportive of what he had to say. But Stephen came to a conclusion. I can't just teach what they want to hear. I've got to teach what they need to hear. And so Stephen's commitment was filled with conviction. I just don't have a choice. It's who I am, and it's what I believe, and it's what I've committed my life to. I'm not going to stop short of sharing the message that has affected and changed my life with other people. Their reaction is up to them. I find it very interesting, by the way, that another group of men preached in Acts chapter 2, and the Bible says the audience was cut to their heart. And when they were cut to the heart, they asked the question, what shall we do? It is worth noting when Stephen preached in Acts chapter 7, the reaction was quite similar. Cut to the heart. But their actions were very different. They drug that man out of town and stoned him to death. Why? Because he told them what they didn't want to hear. It was a message filled with truth and filled with conviction. I'm reminded of the sentiment of the Apostle Paul in Philippians chapter 1, for to me to live is Christ and to die is gain. Stephen understood that. I'm not sure we always do. It's pretty good down here. Air conditioner works most of the time. It's pretty good down here. And I wonder a little bit about the future. I know that day in Acts chapter 7, as Stephen preached, the reaction might not have been what a typical preacher would want it to be. But I think about a young guy who was holding the coats, who was in full agreement with putting Stephen to death, who down the line became a quite powerful gospel preacher. I wonder how many nights before the Apostle Paul went to sleep, his mind went back to a convicted evangelist who was willing to die rather than compromise the truth. We're going to talk about a number of characteristics, but if conviction is not there, you might as well quit. And I wanted to reference this one very quickly. I understand and know one of our good brothers will be speaking tomorrow dealing with Philip, the evangelist. And so I just wanted to make a brief reference, and then I'm going to move on. But one of the things so significant to me about Philip's view of evangelism that I think a lot of us could learn from is that Philip's view of evangelism was flexible. The message was not flexible, but the manner was. He's a great example of somebody who deals with a variety of people and did not necessarily deal with them the exact same way. He gets to the same message. Remember, the Ethiopian started where he was. And you know, like I know, when you deal with people, it's tough to put them in a box. Their backgrounds are different, their histories are different, their personalities are different. For us to be successful soul winners and personal evangelists, there must be a level of flexibility that is conscious of that person rather than stubborn about your own way. Let me move on to the next one. This is Acts chapter 9. And we're going to look at a man named Ananias. Ananias does not fill the pages of your Bible. We we have a random reference to him, but it was a remarkable one. And what Ananias shows us is the view of evangelism that is filled with courage. Ronnie talked about fear being such an aspect of that hinders a lot of us. And one of the things I'd like to say about Ananias is if anybody this world has known had a reason to be scared, I think he'd be at the top of the list. Saul of Tarsus, are you kidding me? That man's got a history and he's well known and his intentions were very clear. I want you to go to him and tell him what he must do. I don't think the fear was gone as Ananias made his way to the place where Saul of Tarsus was. I think he put his faith and trust in God and realized it was important enough to reach out to this soul despite his fear. Good night. I think in some circumstances, it's a waste of our time to try to eliminate fear. I think maybe our greater test just might be, what will we do despite our fears? There's circumstances we face that we've never faced before. There's people we come in contact with that are just flat out difficult and do not make any kind of conversation easy. It does take courage, and it does take time, and it does take a heart that's willing to make a sacrifice for the good of another, despite adversity or hardship that might come your way. But think about how the church has been blessed because of the courage that Ananias showed in going face to face with public enemy number one of the church. You've been blessed today because of the efforts of this courageous brother in Christ. Here's the next one. And this one is pretty significant to me, and I think it's pretty remarkable. And let's pinpoint it to him. It was Saul of Tarsus, right after he was baptized, and the Bible is going to give us a description of what Saul of Tarsus does. And what he does is establishes a type of marching order for the personal evangelist. Here it is. After he was baptized, immediately he preached the Christ in the synagogues, that he is the Son of God. And he did that immediately. From the very beginning, Saul of Tarsus was time conscious. I need to be more time conscious. We plan, we discuss, we stand in parking lots and have conversations. We get out our day planners and make a list. But there comes a time when the planning needs to stop and the action needs to start. The Bible says that Saul came out of the water early on and immediately began preaching and teaching as if, you tell me, as if it was a matter of urgency. Remember 3,000 baptized that day? A logistical nightmare? It is a matter of urgency. He came out of the water with a charge that though he was not a perfect man, he lived through every record of life that we have a commitment to share the gospel with lost souls. Now watch this. with no time to waste. Saul taught us to be time conscious. There's another one that I'd like to share with you tonight, and that is I'd like us to learn something from Barnabas, who was team conscious. He was team conscious. If you were to say that asking the question, how much does it mean to you, is a preeminent question, then I would also follow that up with this statement. And the statement is, the cause is bigger than any of us. I truly believe Barnabas grasped that. He didn't care who stood in the baptistry with the man about to be baptized. He didn't seek credit. He didn't seek attention. He didn't seek prominence. He was a team player, and the cause mattered. We have linked historically so often the names of Paul and Barnabas. But do you also remember there was a time when that tandem was Barnabas and Saul? Barnabas was a front man in some of the great days in the early history of the church. Barnabas was a mentor for the young Christian convert Saul. Yet Barnabas knew there was going to come a day when those roles would be reversed and those roles would change. And Barnabas would begin to work in the shadows, the wingman. And yet through every bit of recorded biblical history that describes Barnabas, we know that him to be an effective communicator and a significant part of the evangelistic team. It was even that same Barnabas that insisted that a struggling John Mark, whose history was not great, but Barnabas insisted that that young man go with him and Paul as they continued their missionary work. Paul was insistent that this not take place. And so they began to separate and go their different directions. And yet it is interesting to note that there came a time when the Apostle Paul cried out for John Mark that he's profitable and valuable to the ministry. We need team players. We need team players who are willing to do whatever they have to do, whether it be out front or whether it be in the shadows, because every soul matters. I wanted to make a quick reference to Silas. One of the reasons I reference Silas is because I truly don't know, we're limited in what we know. But Silas told us the significance of being role conscious. There's no doubt in Acts chapter 16 who the front man was, who the lead was. But I can only imagine how significant Silas was as they dealt with that jailer who within a brief period of time went from taking a sword to take his own life to saying, "Sirs," with a plural, "what must I do to be saved?" I also wonder how valuable Silas was to Paul himself. Can I tell you another secret? I'm a lot stronger when I'm with you. I'm a lot bolder when I'm with you. Many of my fears go away when I'm with you. It's just the reality that we develop a strength in numbers when we work in tandem and groups together. I struggle at times by myself, finding the words, the courage to say what I need to say. But stand by my side, and my strength is renewed. Silas teaches us the value of each other and understanding our roles. The last reference I wanted to make here in this first session is found in the book of Acts, chapters 24 and 26. Paul the apostle viewed evangelism being purpose conscious. If I had to guess, Acts 24 and Acts 26 broke his heart. If I had to guess, the reaction of Felix and the reaction of Agrippa broke his heart. The Bible tells us concerning Felix that he trembled as he heard the gospel presented. When was the last time you saw or experienced that? The Bible tells us about the king, Agrippa, that I'm almost persuaded to become a Christian. Don't you know those answers and those reactions broke Paul's heart? I think in some ways it's much easier to deal with outright rejection than to see and experience a dear soul who is so close to obeying the gospel, but stopping short. In the news in the last month or so, there was a young man in Tuscaloosa who was gunned down by his lady's former boyfriend and lost his life. What the newspapers and television didn't say about this young man is that several years ago, Clark Sims and Charles Lawler, one of the elders at Cottondale at the time, sat down at a conference room table and studied the Bible with that young man who was so close. There was a part of this world he just was not interested in giving up at that time. And he was not, well, he was so close. But Clark's got to know, and you've got to know. And Paul knew you can't do it for them. Our purpose, as one beautiful illustration says, is to make them thirsty. For them to find interest, for them to be taught, but the decision is theirs. It sticks out to me that in one of the earmarked passages of the entire Bible for us, to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, that in the midst of that high-level familiarity and power, there is a fundamental first-grade punctuation mark. Go into all the world and preach the gospel, period. End of thought. Let's start something else. He that believeth and is, well, you know the rest. Our part comes to its fruition at the first grade period. Go, preach, teach everybody. as hurtful and as frustrating as that might be, that's the culmination of what I can do. The decision is up to them. And though you know it broke Paul's heart, he kept on teaching. He kept on preaching. Because despite the reaction of those powerful men, he still knew that every soul matters. May we never let reaction hinder us from fulfilling our purpose. I'm a work in progress. Not where I want or need to be. But may God bless us in the effort that we strive to do more, that we strive to reach more. And good night, Clark, that we try to meet our neighbors. Let me tell you about 2 dates, and then this first session will be over. The first one, April 27, 2011, a major tornado goes through Tuscaloosa. I am a preacher at the Cottondale congregation at that time, and I am living in a house in Huntington Place subdivision in Clear Creek subdivision in Northport, Alabama. My oldest son was not married at that time. All 4 of our children were still living in our house. 3 of them still do, but that's another story. And James Spann and others began telling us about this major storm of drastic proportions heading right to Tuscaloosa. And I'm going to tell you exactly what I did that day. I made sure that my wife and my 4 children were in my house so that to the best of my ability I could take care of them during the storm. And when the storm passed and my house was safe and my family was safe, we went out on an expedition and began checking the very best we could with the members of the congregation where I preached. There were some we couldn't find anything out about that night. There was significant, major damage to a number of our members. But it was our purpose very early on to identify our Christian church family and see to it that they were safe. And then we progressed to a time where we would open up a distribution center where we reached out to those in our community and tried to help the various needs, and they were many. And I still remember the pattern for a tornado. Reach those close to you. Reach those extended from you. Reach those everywhere. Why do you think sometimes we have more concern for people during a storm than we do for their souls? That should never be. Certainly, we reach out to minister to physical needs. but the spiritual should never be on the back burner. It was May of 1982. May of 1982, and I graduated from Tuscaloosa County High School. And it was a graduating class of about 400 in Northport, Alabama. And I can remember that night at the Coliseum in Tuscaloosa where Alabama plays basketball, and I remember putting on a dress and a ridiculous hat and walking across that stage and getting my diploma. What I didn't know was how significant my life was going to change after that night. People that were a part of my everyday became my every now and then. People that I was filled with opportunities to communicate with on a consistent weekly, daily basis became ships that passed through the night. And that's in Northport, Alabama, with people who were living in the same place. I'll never forget pulling through a drive-through window at a local credit union there in Northport. And as I was taking care of my transaction, I looked inside the credit union, and there stood a friend of mine who was standing at the teller line. And this is what we did. He was a part of my every day. We were on teams together. We sang in the school chorus together. I considered him a good friend, living in the same town. What used to be every day was now moments of opportunity are precious. And they just don't last forever. I figure Saul of Tarsus was right on point. We need to be time conscious. Because today is your shot. And every soul matters. Every soul matters. Thanks much.